Here's another map of the Big Thompson River. This is the rapid assessment process that a couple of consultants put together on where the most damage was. And you can see that on the upper reaches of the main stem, damage was comparatively a lot less. In fact, this section of the river is actually looking pretty healthy right now. There's definitely some improvements that could be made, but for the most part, it's well vegetated, it's reasonably stable. There's not a ton of geomorphic change in this reach of the watershed. On the other hand, the North Fork above Drake and the main stem, Big Thompson, why am I not using my stick? The North Fork up here and the main stem suffered a lot more damage. And I guess I should back up and say that this criteria for the damage is both lack of vegetation, risk for geomorphic erosion, effects on the fishery, etc. I think there were 4 different categories: flood risk, geomorphic risk, fisheries, and riparian vegetation. And so that makes a lot of sense because the North Fork and the main stem between Drake and the canyon mouth here are the areas where the gradient is steepest and the canyon is most narrow. And so these areas really didn't stand a chance with the volume of water that was presented to them. We got 18 inches of rain, I think, in the first 24 hours. This broke all the records in Larimer County as well as Boulder County. We got 17,000 CFS at the gauge here in Drake. And to put that in perspective for you, 17,000 cubic feet per second. This is a river that fluctuates between like 50 to 150 CFS, and on the North Fork maybe 20 to 50 at medium to low flow, and maybe the main stem Big Thompson is usually at about 500 CFS during spring runoff. So 150 to 500 up to 17,000, that's a ton of water. Yeah, sure. Uh-huh.
How did the Lake Estes play into the difference?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Sure. So the question was, how did Lake Estes play into the situation here during the flood, right? So this is the main stem, Big Thompson here, and here's Lake Estes, and there's a dam which holds back Lake Estes called Olympus Dam. And Olympus Dam is managed by the Bureau of Reclamation. And basically what happened during the flood was Lake Estes filled up like that. It was already almost full before the flood, so it wasn't in a good position to accept these floodwaters. And so in the first 24 hours, it was almost full, and it became full like that. And the Bureau of Reclamation folks kind of had, the perfect storm of their careers that day. They had some really difficult decisions to make, and they were holding back the floodwaters on Tuesday, September 11th, ironically, 2013, and it became apparent in about a couple of hours that they weren't going to be able to hold back this water. And Olympus Dam is not a flood control dam. It's a dam that was built to hold back a lake, not control floodwaters. We don't build flood control dams in the West. On the East Coast, there's a lot of dams are built specifically to control floodwaters, but this dam was not designed for that purpose, and it was about to break, basically, and so they had to let the water go. And there's a lot of conspiracy theories and mistrust from everybody who lived downstream, saying that they could have done more to mitigate the damage downstream, I really don't buy that. I think these guys are professionals. They were doing the best that they could to deal with the situation that they had at hand. If the dam breached, we would have blown humongous chunks of concrete down the channel, which could have caused more damage. They really had to let it go. 2 people downstream did lose their lives in this event, and I think had they attempted to hold back the water, which was a fool's errand at that point, they could have potentially lost more lives. So a difficult situation, and I definitely feel for those guys who work at that facility. It was not an easy decision that they had to make. So in part of our job in forming the River Restoration Coalition was a truly massive outreach and education campaign. Most of the people that live in the Big Thompson Canyon, in fact, pretty much all of them, are not engineers and geomorphologists and habitat biologists. They did not understand the event. Floods are a natural event. We have flood recurrence intervals, like the 10-year, the 25-year, the 100-year flood. And these are just mathematical equations which tell us the likelihood that we're going to have a flood of a given magnitude in a given year. But as long as it rains on planet Earth, we're going to have floods. And you would not believe how indignant some people are about what happened to them. People treat natural phenomenon like it's a, act of God, once in a lifetime thing that's not, never going to happen. But the fact of the matter is we had 200+ year floods in 40 years. We had a flood in 1976. There was about a 100-year flood. We had a flood in 2013 that was, depending on where you are on the map, between a 100 and 1,000-year flood. We had 2 of those within 40 years. So, that's probability, right? These things are natural and they happen. And so we launched a massive education campaign to reach as many people as we could and bring them up to speed, not only on what happened to them, but what resources were at their disposal. And so I spent a lot of time having coffee with homeowners in the Big Thompson Canyon and, just kind of shooting the breeze and doing the aw shucks routine, which is not something that you really picture yourself doing in a professional career in natural resources, but it had to happen. And I think we really got the word out there. We have a website for the coalition, which is really successful, and we got a lot of landowners who participate in the coalition, and I mean, that's pretty monumental. It took a lot of work, but it is working. After the flood, we were faced with a lot of complex problems and a lot of debris, and this is one of the examples of a nice little silver lining that was available to us. There were a ton of these root wad trees scattered all over the place that were deposited after the flood. And the small stuff we can't really use except for maybe for mulch, but these large trees with the root balls still attached just so happen to be a perfect structure for fish habitat and habitat for other creatures as well, both terrestrial and aquatic. And as I said earlier, there used to be a ton of trees and streams because of both beaver and just because of natural accumulation of wood in these streams. And so we launched a campaign to take these off private property and stockpile them wherever we could. And I think we did a reasonable job. Unfortunately we lost a lot of these to firewood, but we were able to stockpile as many of these as we could, and we're going to be using these in our restoration projects, actually putting them back in the streams to help create that fish habitat and that grade control. These large woody debris or large woody material, also known as tow wood or root wads, they have a bunch of different names depending on who you talk to, but these things are fantastic for fish habitat. If you stick them, you kind of like dig a trench and stick them into the bank with the root ball sticking upstream, and they provide the same service that riprap provides for the stream bank, but without the kind of man-made, ugly, for lack of a better word, appearance. And you know, as opposed to riprap, you know, they puts organic material back into the soil. Vegetation can grow up around it. It traps moisture beneath it. It provides refugia for fish, right? Because the root ball would be sticking out into the stream, so that provides a little place for fish to hide. Macroinvertebrates like to attach themselves to these things and hatch onto wood as well as cobblestones if you're a fly fisherman. So wood is really, you know, organic matter in streams is really the baseline of the ecosystem, and in its current state we have precious little of it. And so we took advantage of this opportunity to scavenge and put back as much organic material as we can into the stream to help start those, you know, both physical and biological processes.
Was there much natural stocking that occurred towards the end when the stream flows, you know, velocity kind of started to slow down after the flood?
Natural stocking of woody material?
Yeah.
Yeah, they're
pretty much all pushed down now.
No, that's a good question. So the question was, did the flood put woody material back into the stream as the floodwaters receded, right? So during the flood, we would have super high velocity that would literally pick up trees and boulders half the size of this room and move them downstream. And as the velocity decreased, you know, as with sediment, these boulders and organic material would get dropped out of suspension onto the stream bed. And that's exactly what did happen. So the answer to your question is yes. Unfortunately, after the flood, there was this kind of knee-jerk reaction by CDOT and mostly by CDOT's contractors and other federal and state agencies, contractors who were tasked with the emergency river work. And so in the process of them rebuilding the road and building this temporary stabilized channel, they pretty much ripped every log out of the stream. They considered it debris. There was no distinction made between beneficial debris and trash debris, or organic debris and inorganic debris. And you know, your average Joe Schmo excavator operator has no background in fisheries, so he doesn't know the difference. So we did the best that we could. Unfortunately, we failed at getting that stuff to be just left in the stream. I mean, the river really took care of itself. It deposited all this good stuff after the flood. And if we could have just left that stuff, we would have saved ourselves a lot of work. But, you know, the few geomorphologists and biologists and engineers who are savvy to this concept did not have a voice that was nearly as loud as the emergency, you know, effort to get the road opened and get the corridor cleaned up. So I think I'm reasonably happy with the result that we were at least able to stockpile some of this stuff for later use. I think that's a acceptable compromise, but some of my colleagues, aquatic biologists that we work with, were really, really unhappy about this. So yeah, that's an excellent question.